If we take an alphabetical list of the peoples who inhabit this planet, one of the first names we come across is that of the Abkhazians. Who are the Abkhazians and where is Abkhazia? These are questions, along with a myriad others, which this program is designed to answer. My name is George Hewitt, and I am Professor of Caucasian Languages at London University's School of Oriental and African Studies. I should like to invite you to join me on a journey as I travel the length and breadth of this gem of a land in order to see what treasures it has to offer. Hiya, Khali. So where is Abkhazia? It occupies a very small triangular-shaped patch of territory at the extreme northwest of Transcaucasia, or the Southern Caucasus, as the politically correct lobbyists insist on it being known today. Bound by the Black Sea, Georgia, the Great Caucasian Mountain Range, Europe's highest, it has its northern border with Russia along the River Pso, and stretching some 170 kilometers in a southeasterly direction towards Georgia, its Georgian border runs along the river Ingur. Many deem the Caucasus to be the dividing line between Europe and Asia. Others are not so certain. So am I standing in Europe or am I standing in Asia? Well, who can say? So let's compromise and agree that those people who inhabit the isthmus between the Black and Caspian Seas live at the intersection of Europe and Asia, forming a bridge between these two continents, somewhat sturdier than the one on which I find myself standing now. And so here we are on the site of the ancient Greek colony Pitsunda in the north of Abkhazia. This was but one of a number of colonies founded by the ancient Greeks. They founded a number of colonies around the Black Sea coast, and this part of the world, to the ancient Greeks, the ancients in general, was part of the area they called Colchis. Now, Colchis is well known to anybody who has read or heard about the myth of Jason and the Argonauts. This area is full of history. While we have been standing here, we simply knelt down and found this piece of pottery. It doesn't date from the middle of the first millennium BC, it dates from the first centuries of the Christian era, but this is part of a Greek amphora, or wine storage vessel. Why, it may be asked, is this area called Pitsunda? Well, we can answer that quite simply, but to do so, we have to move a little way from this spot, just round the corner to the coast, and we will see the answer at a glance. And so we have traveled just a few hundred yards from our previous site here to the coast. And you can see, growing all around me, some wonderful pines. This particular variety of pine has grown here for thousands of years, and in fact grows nowhere else. And so the name Pitsunda is obviously connected somehow with the term pine, which in ancient Greek was Pitius. And the Greeks called this area Pitius Homegas, in other words, the large place of pines. Now, from the object case of Pitius comes Pitiunta, and Pitiunta gives us Pitsunda as we know the place today. But of course, Pitsunda is primarily famous, and justifiably so, for being perhaps the most glorious tourist resort, not only in Abkhazia, but in the whole of the Caucasus. And It is easy to see why it has such a reputation, with hundreds of thousands of tourists, primarily from the former Soviet bloc and now from Russia, if only one takes the chance to look around this most glorious of bays. Abkhazia, specifically Pitsunda, played a peripheral role in an event of true world significance. In the early 1960s, Nikita Khrushchev was on holiday at his dacha in the trees behind me. One day, on the veranda, he was asked whether he was aware that the Americans had nuclear missiles trained on various Soviet targets from their bases just over the Black Sea in Turkey. Apparently, he was not aware, but decided that he needed to take action in retaliation. He dispatched a number of Soviet missiles to be set up on the island of Cuba, thereby bringing the world the closest it has ever been to nuclear catastrophe. Nice to see you.
I'm glad we made it finally.
We've got to this point in the film anyway.
Yes, great.
Take a seat over here.
Yeah.
I'll chat about things.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Lord Rea, it's very nice to see you at long last here in Abkhazia, and I'd just like to point out that we're in the very centre of Sukhum, by the beach. This is a famous spot where elderly people gather, perhaps people who've been in politics or academics, and they like to play chess under a tree, giving some protection against the heat. So maybe we could have a little game while we're talking.
Right. You move as white.
Right.
Well, it's quite appropriate, as I am an elderly person that has been involved in politics. I should be sitting here. Now, George, I found out a little bit about Abkhazia before I came, but perhaps I should hear from you what you see as the most important problems facing Abkhazia today.
Well, of course, they had a war with Georgia in 92-93, and the country was long under blockade. It's still not entirely open insofar as it's difficult to get here. Investment is difficult to arrange other than with Russians. There's so much in the country to offer the outside world, and the outside world knows very little about it. We're already 14 years after the war, and the situation here has been described as one of no war, no peace, because although Abkhazians have de facto independence, they're striving for it to be recognized de jure. And we're making a film about Abkhazia, about the people, about the country, about the political issues, which we hope will help to resolve this by showing Western viewers what Abkhazia is all about.
Well, that's very interesting, because I shall be watching some of this film being made. But sitting here, it looks idyllic, and with life going on peacefully as usual. It'll be interesting to see the country and see the signs of where things are still needing to be improved.
Well, as you know, we're hoping to make arrangements for you to travel and see the sights, and to meet people, including, of course, the President, so that you'll be able to gauge these issues more accurately for yourself. And I might take this opportunity of saying something I was reminded of just yesterday, namely that refer to the beauty of Abkhazia. And of course, someone said, one of the poets has written here, that the beauty of Abkhazia has only brought its sorrow, which is sad to reflect upon, given all of the people over the years who've tried to control the country. We'll meet again, no doubt, towards the end of your stay, and discuss your opinion after you've met your people and seen the views, and see if we can come to some sort of conclusion.
Perhaps it's my move now.
Perhaps it is. If our first view of the Caucasus must have been similar to that which met the first Western settlers here some 2,500 years ago, it is perhaps now time to ask, who are the native inhabitants of this land? The narrow strip of territory dividing Black from Caspian seas is home to Europe's, and let's accept we are in Europe, most variegated patchwork of ethnic groups and languages. Apart from a number of languages belonging to families not native to the region but which are now spoken here, such as Russian, Armenian and Azeri, there is a multitude of languages belonging to the various peoples who are judged to be autochthonous for the simple reason that we do not know whence they came. So complex is the linguistic situation in the Caucasus that the 10th century Arab geographer al-Mas'udi styled the Caucasus the mountain of tongues. There are then some 40 so-called languages of the Caucasus. They are divided into two, some would say 3 language families. Georgian is the only Caucasian language to possess a long history of writing, which dates back to the late 4th century. The early Soviets sought to overcome Tsarism's legacy of illiteracy by creating a number of so-called young written languages, and Abkhaz was one of these. Though the first attempts had been made to establish a written form for Abkhaz in the late 19th century, its history of writing really dates from only about a century ago. Its current script is based on Cyrillic, used for Russian, though a language reform was introduced in 1999. During its relatively short history of writing, it has been through more than its fair share of scripts. It does, however, share with a number of mainly North Caucasian peoples a strong oral folklore tradition with an epic cycle of a race of giants called the Narts. And one of the towering figures from those early days was Dmitry Gulia, or Dermit Gulia, as he is known in Abkhaz, 1874 to 1960. He has justifiably been awarded the sobriquet of Father of Abkhazian Literature because of his many pathfinding contributions to so many areas of literature. I'm holding in my hand just one example, which is a translation from Russian he published in 1921. And we happen to be standing at the moment in Gulia's House Museum, which lies at the center of the Republic's capital, which is known to the world as Sukhum, although the Abkhazians have their own designation for the town, which is Aqwa. At the age of 17, Gulia created the first practical teaching alphabet for Abkhaz, which he used himself traveling around Abkhazian villages. And in 1925, he produced this book, the very first history of Abkhazia. But let us return to history. Another colony established by the ancient Greeks along this coast was called Dioscurias, later renamed Sebastopolis. And I'm standing here amid the Roman ruins of Sebastopol alongside Sukhum's famous promenade along the seafront. Pliny, a writer of the 1st century AD, mentioned that the Romans needed no fewer than 130 interpreters in order to conduct business at this spot. And this underlines the linguistic complexity of not only Abkhazia, but the whole Caucasus. A whole range of ancient artifacts is available here at the State Museum for visitors to appreciate. Classical remains are not the oldest type of surface structures to be found within Abkhazia, however. There are two types of massive stone structures, or megaliths, reminiscent of the sort of things we find all over Europe and in England at Stonehenge, for instance. I'm sitting here beside one of these, which is an ancient burial chamber, 5,000 years old. This type of burial chamber is known as a dolmen or a hatgun in Abkhaz. This particular example was found at the village of Eshera, just to the north of the capital Sukhum, and was brought here to be reconstructed, standing outside the entrance to the State Museum. But the descendants of the people who are assumed to have created such archaic monuments have not always found themselves able to control the destiny of their native land. The Greeks and Romans were but the first of a series of foreigners who strove to dominate this territory. However, before we leave the Roman period, it is important to investigate a very important development, namely the introduction of Christianity here. Officially, Christianity was introduced into Abkhazia during the reign of the Emperor Justinian. Justinian reigned between the years 543 and 546. But there is evidence that Christianity was relevant here in Pitsunda long before that. The early church held a very important universal gathering at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. And in the list of those attending the council was one Stratophil, who was named as the Bishop of Pitsunda. But of course today, Pitsunda is most famous, both in Abkhazia and far beyond, for the beautiful church which you can see behind me. This is the largest church in Abkhazia, and clearly it has been restored. It dates from its original building from the 6th century, and the building continued through to the 10th. In the famous restaurant by the rocks above the village of Eshera, I met somebody I formerly knew as Father Nazari, but today he has taken the name Ignatius. This was when he became a monk. He explained to me his views about current problems in the church, the differences between the older and younger generation of priests, for instance, and also problems he sees in Abkhazia in general, feeling that if more people were to return to the Russian Orthodox Church which he serves, then this would only help the democratic process in Abkhazia. We are now in the church at Dranda, 20-minute drive southeast of Sukhum. The church dates to the 6th century. It is modeled on the world-famous Hagia Sophia at Istanbul, which was founded by the Emperor Justinian. Anyone who has been to Hagia Sophia will recognize the similarities immediately. Interestingly, this church represents a rather unique architectural style for the Caucasus. And one of the features which is unique is its resemblance directly to Hagia Sophia in its cupola. The church stands at the center of what was once a monastery complex. The monastery itself no longer functions, but church services were reintroduced here some 4 years ago and now attract a regular weekly congregation. That the apostles Andrew the First called and Simon the Canaanite came to Abkhazia to preach the word of God. St. Simon is believed to have been beheaded and buried in this exquisite location of New Athos, formerly called Pserdska. And it is here that we find this 9th, 10th century church dedicated to the saint. But the majority of pilgrims today come to New Athos more to worship tourism than God. Dominating New Athos is Anacapia, the ancient capital of Abkhazia. The walls surrounding it date to the 4th, 5th centuries, but the church within the walls was built in the 7th to 8th centuries. The Roman Emperor Justinian established 2 episcopal sees on Abkhazian territory. The first was at Pitsunda, as we have already seen. The second was here at Anacapia. It is fully appropriate that we should be here at Anacapia, the ancient center of power, to continue our survey of Abkhazian history. Because it was here, by these very walls, in 737, that an Arab army under Murvan ibn Muhammad, known as Murvan the Deaf, suffered a defeat. Their defeat was a factor in Leon I, potentate of Abkhazia, being able to strengthen his position in western Transcaucasia. Subsequently, with Byzantine power on the wane in the late 8th century, his successor, Leon II, took the opportunity to extend his domains by seizing a significant stretch of territory in the neighboring western Georgia. In fact, he occupied land as far as the Lychy Mountains, the Lychy Mountains being the traditional dividing line between the western Georgian provinces on the one hand and the central eastern provinces on the other. Leon created for himself the title King of the Abkhazians, and this Kingdom of Abkhazia, which continued to hold within its borders the whole of what is currently western Georgia, lasted for some 2 centuries, from about 780 to 978. During this period, the term Abkhazia, in whatever language this or that historical document happened to be written, referred to all the territory belonging to the King of Abkhazia. And the kingdom's capital was moved in the late 8th century from here at Anacapia to Kutaisi, which is today the 2nd largest city in Georgia, lying in the western province of Imereti. In 1008, Bagrat, who is known as Bagrat II according to the Abkhazian tradition, but Bagrat III according to the Georgian tradition, was the first king of the united kingdom of the Abkhazians and the Georgians. Bagrat built this magnificently positioned church in the 11th century. It stands above the village of Bedia in Abkhazia's Tqachal district, which lies inland from Ochemchira. Inside there is a fresco, now sadly faded and vandalized, depicting Bagrat as the church's founder. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, the Genoese had trading posts all along the coast of the Black Sea, including Abkhazia. And it is interesting to note that until the arrival of the Mongols in the mid-13th century, the term for Abkhazia in the various written sources acquired an even larger territorial sense than it had previously possessed. It came to be synonymous during the period of the joint kingdom of the Abkhazians and Georgians with the native term that Georgia has for Georgia itself. And the reason for this is clearly the absolutely fundamental role that the Abkhazians had played in the creation of that joint kingdom. In the early 16th century, Ottoman Turkey, thanks to her dominance of the Black Sea behind me, began to influence developments in this part of the Caucasus. And it was from this time that Islam started to find a certain level of support amongst the native Abkhazians. Russia had begun to turn its eyes towards the Caucasus from the late 18th century, but the freedom-loving North Caucasian tribes stood in the way of Russia's consolidation in the area. In 1810, Abkhazia found itself under Russian protection, though local rulers continued to administer their own affairs until Russia took full control following the final defeat of the North Caucasian opposition, when the alliance of Northwest Caucasian tribes surrendered on the 21st of May 1864 at Krasnaya Polyana. This is a spot inland from the modern resort of Sochi and on the site of the venue for the 2014 Winter Olympics. Large numbers of Abkhazians elected to depart and set off, often in overcrowded, inadequate boats, to find a new life abroad.
You are building a society, but very much under the protection of the Russian peacekeeping force and your big neighbor on the other side of the border. How does that affect your building your democracy and your fair society?
For us today, the presence of the Russian peacekeepers is a factor of stability.
Yes.
On the other hand, you probably heard that during presidential elections there was a lot of pressure from Russia on the Abkhazian side to have the candidate
A different
candidate.
Not President Bagapsh.
Not President
The other,
yes. His opponent. And though they were risking the relationship with the only ally they have today, still people insisted, we want to govern ourselves and we want to govern our affairs.
Sure.
I think you are right that it is very difficult to build democracy here, because when you have so many threats around this enemy, which remind time to time the military threats, and this very big neighbor as Russia, with its way of dealing with internal processes, which we don't like how it goes now.
Well, Russia is trying to preserve the status quo at the moment, both in Kosovo and in Abkhazia.
Yeah.
But the rest of the world is trying to impose a resolution on us, which we don't think is fair.
Here at New Athos, on the coast, about a 20-minute drive northwest of Sukhum, we find a still functioning monastery. It was built in the 1870s by the Russians once they had finally established control over Abkhazia. Russian monks were brought from the Russian monastery on Mount Athos in northern Greece to oversee the construction. And it is a wonderfully colourful addition, a man-made addition, to the natural wonders that Athos, New Athos, has to offer. It is essential to stress the importance of Christianity to Abkhazia, because many people are under the misapprehension that the Abkhazians largely adhere to the Muslim faith. So far, everything we have seen on our journey through Abkhazia has been above ground. Now, our excursion brings us beneath it. We are here, deep inside the hill at New Athos, above which stands the ancient capital and fortress known as Anacopia. In 1961, a boy called Givi Smir, who today is in charge of the whole tourist complex here at New Athos, discovered a hole in the mountainside. Crawling through, this is what he discovered. The cave complex at New Athos is one of the 3 largest in volume in the world.
The history of it's really quite unusual. Nikita Khrushchev was in America, and the American president invites him to visit a cave some 3 hours' drive from Washington. He was perplexed, our Nikita Khrushchev, and he gave strict orders to find anywhere in the USSR a cave and make it comfortable for visitors. And here you are, such a wonder. There was a big expedition, maybe some 30 men. The assault group consisted of 4 men, me included, and it was certainly a colossal undertaking. And nowadays it would not be possible to equip the cave, to find the necessary funds. It's become a real wonder, but it has to be admitted that the project was not entirely well thought out from the point of view of ecology. It was not taken into account that the water in the cave lakes can rise, and the water did rise, and it went up this channel and flowed out just here in the middle of the town.
The Abkhazians who live in the northern part of Abkhazia speak the Bzip dialect, and an annual festival to celebrate Bzip culture has been established here at Lukhna Ashta, or Lukhna Meadow. The Abkhazians who live in the central part of Abkhazia are known as Abjua, or Middle People. And since the 1970s, a popular festival has been instituted here at Muk Meadow, celebrating Abjuan culture. Dotted around me are reconstructed examples of the traditional wickerwork dwelling of the Abkhazians called patskhes. The Caucasus was independent for a few years following the Russian Revolution of 1917. And this period, when the Georgian government was of a Menshevik flavor, was a period of oppression for Abkhazia. For this reason, Abkhazia, unlike Georgia, welcomed the appearance in the Transcaucasus of the Red Army in 1921. On the 4th of March that year, Soviet power was established here, and on the 21st of May, the Abkhazian Soviet Socialist Republic was recognized by Georgia's Revolutionary Committee. On the 16th of December, Abkhazia signed a special contract of alliance with Georgia, whereas on the 13th of December in 1922, Abkhazia, along with Georgia, entered as fully equal partners the Transcaucasian Federation, along with Armenia and Azerbaijan. In February 1931, quite against the will of its leadership and people, Abkhazia lost its status as a treaty republic associated with Georgia to become a mere autonomous republic within Georgia, by order of the man who by then had amassed full control of the Kremlin within his own hands, namely one Josip Jurashvili, a Georgian known to the world as Joseph Stalin, who proceeded to cultivate his conception of the Soviet Union. Although Stalin never built for himself a dacha, actually within Pitsunda, he did in 1932 occupy the northern end of the Pitsunda Bay here at Misra and built this rather small dacha for himself and his guests. It was from this balcony that he used to sit and watch his favorite films on a screen built on a wall directly in front of me.
знает, тот никогда и нигде не пропадет.
The first communist leader of Abkhazia, Nestor Lagoba, was a genuinely popular leader because he managed to protect Abkhazia from the Kremlin's excesses during the 1920s. However, after he declined Stalin's invitation in 1936 to become the Soviet Union's head of the Secret Service, he was promptly poisoned in Tbilisi by Stalin's main lieutenant in the Caucasus, the Mingrelian Lavrenti Beria, who was born actually in Abkhazia. This heralded a period of intensive Georgianization of Abkhazian life. Abkhazian intellectuals were liquidated. There was mass importation of Georgian speakers, mainly Mingrelians, from Georgia to swamp the Abkhazians on their native territory. Abkhazian language schools were closed in 1945 to be replaced by Georgian language schools, and publishing and broadcasting in Abkhaz was banned. It is true these measures were put into reverse after the death of Stalin in 1953, but they have remained in the collective Abkhazian memory as an indication of what so-called autonomy actually means within Georgia.
The question that I think many people would like to ask is, how is that independence to be preserved when the big bear is just the other side of the border and the country is so heavily dependent on Russia?
Very many people, both in Russia and in the Western countries, would like us to re-enter Georgia as it was before, but of course it was Stalin and Beria who forced us into Georgia in the first place. It is not possible to resolve any conflict or a complicated post-war situation if only one side is being heard. The European Union, European Parliament and other international institutions alike are listening only to Georgia. But according to the position of the United Nations Organization, there are two sides in the conflict, Georgia and Abkhazia.
That was a very well argued statement, and I think it puts the Abkhaz case very well. I would like to see you talking to a meeting of the United Nations, and if you could give us a version of that speech. It's something that deserves to be heard at the United Nations.
Remembering the days of Stalin, and well aware that by 1989, the 93,000 or so Abkhazians who then lived in Abkhazia represented a mere 17.8% of their republic's population, the Abkhazians responded to the invitation issued by Gorbachev under his policy of glasnost and voiced their grievances about life within Georgia. They did this largely in response to the ugly and rampant chauvinism which erupted in Georgia in the late 1980s and which threatened various minorities living within what was still the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Abkhazians' determination to take control of their own destiny back into their own hands by purely peaceful means was met only by armed assault from Eduard Shevardnadze's Georgia on the 14th of August 1992. It is the 15th anniversary of that invasion which is being commemorated here today.
In this hard time for our fatherland, I appeal to each citizen, whatever nationality he is, to stand up in defense of Abkhazia. We are invincible in such unity.
Now let us listen to the words of those who actually fought in the war.
That time, what I was witnessing was, well, the collapse of the Soviet Union. All those permanent rallies in the time of Gamsakirdia at a certain moment made me, a young guy, start all of a sudden to think, why should anybody humiliate me in this way, raising doubts about my living here on the land of my ancestors? And I, for instance, remember very well the feeling of foreboding that there would be a war. In any case, there were the events of 1989 when already blood was spilt. At different times in the history of the Georgians and the Abkhazians, after all, in principle we have been neighbours already for centuries, things took a different course. And I do hope that this gloomy part of our history will sooner or later be over, and that, banal as it may sound, wars do end sooner or later, and peace is restored.
Война, она все-таки когда-нибудь заканчивается и начинается мир.
First of all, the huge losses among people we were close to. These are incurable wounds, incurable. The only thing that might assuage them is creative activity. They are wounds which bleed till the end of one's life, quite literally. There were very many instances of maiming by mines in my unit. Even now, when I enter a meadow, all of a sudden I forget myself and think, mines? Even now, after all these years, yes, a full 15 years have passed.
Many places were to suffer destruction during the course of the war between Georgia and Abkhazia in 1992-1993. But the village of Eshera was always going to be a prominent target. One reason was that it stands virtually on the front line, separating the Georgians from the Abkhazians to the north of Sukhum. The second reason is that it happens to be the native village of the then leader of Abkhazia, President Vladislav Ardzenba. Behind me stands what was the village school, and the results of constant shelling are clear for all to see. Of course, the main tragedies in a war are associated with the killing and maiming of its human victims. And it should not be forgotten that during the war with Georgia, the Abkhazians lost no fewer than 4% of their population. However, on the 22nd of October 1992, a particularly vicious act of cultural vandalism, which was quite calculated, took place on the grassy plot behind me. Standing here at the time was the Abkhazian Research Institute of History, Literature and Language, and housed within it was a very precious archive. That night, Georgian occupiers torched the building. The aim of their arson was to erase documentary proof of the very presence of Abkhazians on Abkhazian soil, thereby facilitating Georgia's claims to the territory. When firefighters arrived to douse the flames, they were prevented from doing so at gunpoint.
This sequence tells the story of the liberation of the Abkhazian capital Sukhum from Georgian occupation.
With the recapture of their capital, Sukhum, effectively the war ended on the 27th of September 1993. Lenin had already been removed from his plinth in front of this former administrative center of Abkhazia. In recapturing this building, the Abkhazians had to destroy it, and it has remained in this state since the end of the war.
Well, one of the things that I've seen which has been sad has been a number of small enterprises, even quite large factories. Up in Forcelli, the coal cleaning plant was completely out of action, and I believe there's other fairly large industries that are just not working now. What chance is there of getting them up and running
During the Soviet period, unjustifiably large industrial objects were constructed. The aim of this was to import manpower to these enterprises from Georgia. In other words, it was a kind of pump for pumping in a new population. Immediately after the war, no one was optimistic about restoring the tourist trade. But it happened nevertheless, and with every year the stream of tourists grows. Now, in connection with the construction work ahead of the Sochi Olympics, there is great interest in the region, and we have already received many offers to restore and develop here the production of bricks, cement, etc. All these will be in great demand, and there is no doubt that Abkhazia, one way or another, will be involved in the project.
In the village of Brupch or Duripch, Rosa Tarba was kind enough to welcome us into her house and to show us around her garden and holdings. She has lived here for 44 years. During the war, almost everybody in Abkhazia lost someone in the family, and Rosa sadly lost her 26-year-old son, Aslan. It is now 14 years since the end of the war. Abkhazia has been de facto independent but remains unrecognized by the international community. The people here during these years have been trying to develop a democratic society, and now let those people speak for themselves.
Yeah, Abkhazia is a multicultural and multi-ethnic society, and I think this is a positive characteristic of our country. There are different communities living here. For example, there is a big Armenian community that I represent. There is a Russian community, Estonian community, Greek community, and many others. Of course, there are problems, but every multi-ethnic country has this program. We can coexist together in one country. What is important that there is opportunity for people of different ethnic background to realize themselves. I think I had chance to realize myself and to live comfortably in this country because I have job that I like. I can do. I have a chance to participate in the political processes that go on. I'm actively involved always in the election processes, and recently I became a member of Sukhum City Assembly. My example can show that it is possible for any ordinary person living in Abkhazia. We can say about schools, because Armenians, for example, can learn on their own language in Abkhazia, and this is not like private system or something. This is a state educational system, and there are Armenian schools, and children can go and learn on their own language.
Well, Lord Rea, it's been exactly a week since you first arrived in Abkhazia with a number of questions and thoughts. I wonder, on the basis of what you've seen and whom you've met, whether your questions have been answered and what your general impressions are now.
Well, in a week I have been up and down this small country from bottom to top, as it were, and met a lot of people, including the President, Mr. Bagat, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Health, some local non-government organization organizers, as well as some international NGOs. And my impression on talking to all of them is that this country is a country that is run by its own government in no uncertain terms. That, as far as I can see, there is no, not a trace of any evidence that Russians are involved in the day-to-day administration of this country. It's very much an independent going concern, except that, of course, it is in considerable economic difficulty at the moment because of the sanctions that have been imposed at the request of Georgia by the CIS and seem to have been more or less observed by the rest of the world as well. So this country doesn't get the economic assistance that a normal recognized country would. And there is still residual damage from what was an extremely destructive and cruel little war 15 years ago. Many buildings should still show signs of damage. Some have been rebuilt and rebuilt very well. And there's no doubt that the economy, although still nowhere near at the level it was, is recovering. And there are now lots of Russian tourists, although I gather nowhere near so many as there were before the war. I think the people of this country are showing very considerable determination and spirit, and they are very coherent and loyal to the notion of Abkhaz as a nation. And I have learned since I've been here that Abkhazia was a nation for 1,200 years before it was included in Georgia by Stalin in 1931. So it has got a history of standing on its own feet, and it seems very much as it is doing now, but it needs outside help, and it needs to be allowed to enter the family of nations, I think.
Mm-hmm. And there is no one you've met who gave you any indication they wish to go back to the previous situation with Abkhazia under Tbilisi's control?
No, it was difficult, of course, because I was being entertained by Abkhazia, but I kept my eyes and ears open, and I did meet Armenians, Mingrelians, a fierce Mingrelian taxi driver who drove very, very fast, but he still was in favor of this country remaining independent.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you very much for those impressions. I'm sure the people who watch this film will find them interesting too. Thank you very much. Well, I have tried to tell you about the Abkhazians, their land, its history, but this is the view of a visitor from outside, a non-native. Let us take a look at a group of people standing just beside the church in Dranda with their children members of different generations, discussing in Abkhaz what they can see in the panorama opening up before them. This perhaps will give you a little better insight into what the people themselves are like than anything said by me could possibly tell you about them.